Right now, underneath a city you could probably name on a map, a city with a hockey rink and a Tim Hortons and a municipal website listing its population to the nearest 100. The ground is not what the map says it is. It is hollow in a way that is not accidental, not the ordinary hollow of roots and aquifer and compressed glacial clay. This is a different kind of hollow, deliberate, shaped by hands, engineered for purposes that the official records of that city were never intended to preserve. Somewhere beneath Saskatchewan, passages connect basement to basement through brick laid in patterns that no licensed contractor ever filed a permit for. Somewhere beneath British Columbia, rooms with evidence of cooking fires and sleeping areas sit below the floors of buildings that have been renovated 3 times. Since anyone living remembers what was down there. Somewhere beneath Nova Scotia, modifications were made to military tunnels that do not appear in any document currently available to researchers under Freedom of Information requests. If this sounds like the opening of a conspiracy theory, that reaction is worth examining. Because the conspiracy theory version of this story, ancient civilizations' secret elite agendas, suppressed technology, is everywhere, and it is almost entirely wrong. The actual story is harder to find. Not because it is better hidden, but because it is better disguised as something ordinary, as something not worth looking for. That disguise has a name. Historians call it the shifting baseline. Each generation of researchers looks at the underground of Canadian cities and towns through the lens of what the existing records describe, treats that description as the complete picture, and stops asking questions. The passages are steam heat infrastructure. The rooms are informal storage. The modifications are just contractors doing contractor things. Move along. Nothing to see here. Certainly nothing to dig for. For most of the last 150 years, the dominant assumption in Canadian historical scholarship, in urban archaeology, in civic planning history, in the kind of work that gets published in journals and taught in universities, was that the ground beneath Canadian cities was essentially a blank slate before the cities themselves arrived. Canada was young. European settlement was recent. The colonial towns of the 18th and 19th centuries were planted on land that planners described, with a particular and revealing choice of words, as empty. Empty land has no underground history worth investigating. You put down your grid. You build your buildings along it. What's below is just earth. Some pipes eventually. Some utility tunnels when the pipes got complicated. Nothing more. This framework had a problem. It assumed that the only histories that mattered underneath the ground were the histories that matched what was recorded above it. The documented histories, the colonial histories, the histories of mayors and water main installation schedules and building permits filed in triplicate. But the people, most likely to have created something significant underground in the long gap between European contact and the full establishment of colonial infrastructure, were precisely the people whose histories the official records were least designed to capture. Indigenous nations whose relationship with this land, including its underground, stretches back thousands of years before any surveyor arrived with a theodolite. Chinese laborers whose very existence the Canadian government spent decades trying to legislate out of public life. Black communities who had followed the North Star to freedom and found that even freedom came with walls. Métis people navigating a world that was simultaneously trying to extinguish their identity and borrow their knowledge of the landscape. These were not the people writing the administrative records that later historians would spend their careers analyzing. Their underground was never going to show up in a waterworks ledger. And so, a question that should have been asked consistently for a century was almost never asked at all. What if the absence of documentation is not evidence of absence? What if the absence of documentation is itself the story? That is the question this documentary is going to follow. Slowly, the way you would follow a tunnel with only a candle. Not because the darkness is romantic, though there is something to that, but because the darkness is real. And what is in it is more human, more layered, and more important than the official map of Canada has ever been willing to admit. Settle in. If you are using this to fall asleep, that is exactly what it was designed for. The tunnels are not going anywhere. They have waited this long. They can wait until morning. And if you are still awake, leave a comment before you drift. Tell us where you are and what you think might be beneath your feet. It is always interesting to imagine the layers. The cognitive error at the heart of this story is not stupidity. It is a very specific kind of intellectual trap that historians have a name for. The observer effect, compounded by baseline assumption. When you look at a landscape, any landscape, you see it through the lens of what you already know to be there. The official records tell you there is a utility tunnel, so you see a utility tunnel. The official records tell you the land was empty before European settlement, so you see empty land. The evidence that contradicts those baseline assumptions does not disappear. It simply becomes invisible. Not because it is hidden, but because the framework being used to look for it was never designed to find it. This is what happened with the underground of Canada for most of the last century. The anomalies were found consistently and regularly. A tunnel beneath a Moose Jaw building, being renovated in the 1980s. A series of interconnected rooms beneath Victoria's Chinatown, documented by a researcher who filed her notes and moved on. Passages found beneath Halifax buildings that everyone agreed were military fortifications, and then stopped asking about. Each anomaly received an explanation. Each explanation was plausible, and each explanation ended the inquiry rather than deepening it. There is a particular phrase that appears, with variations, in dozens of historical reports about underground spaces in Canadian cities. The phrase is, "of no further historical significance." It appears at the bottom of construction reports, in the margins of archaeological site assessments, in the internal memos of heritage offices. Overwhelmed with above-ground properties that needed immediate attention. Of no further historical significance, meaning, we found something, we gave it the minimum viable explanation, and we moved on. What was lost in those moments of moving on is not fully recoverable. Some of it has been physically destroyed. Some of it has been buried under new concrete. Some of it has simply decayed in the dark without anyone measuring it or sampling it or photographing it before it disappeared. The underground history of Canada has been edited by neglect in real time, across 100 years, in a process so ordinary and so distributed that it never looked like erasure while it was happening. Here is what was actually underneath the assumption of emptiness, though. Here is what the ground was holding that the official story was not designed to find. The history of Canada's underground is, at its core, the history of what happens when a society builds its surface for certain people and refuses it to others. What happens architecturally? What happens spatially? What the excluded build when they are pushed off the visible map and into the spaces below it? That history has several chapters. They do not all connect to each other directly. They were produced by different communities in different periods under different conditions of persecution. But they share a structural logic that becomes visible once you stop looking at each chapter in isolation and start seeing the pattern they form together. The underground across all of these stories is where people go when the surface closes against them. It is the architecture of the refused, and it is far more extensive, far more intentional, and far more human than the official history of Canada has ever been willing to fully acknowledge. We are going to move through that history slowly. There are people in it who deserve more than a footnote, and the spaces they built deserve more than a plausible explanation that closes the file. We owe them the harder work of actually looking. To understand what was built underground, you first have to understand what was being done above it. And that means going to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, in the years just after the last spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway was driven, when a question that Canada had not yet decided how to answer was pressing against every door and every basement wall in Chinatowns, from the coast to the edge of the prairie. Moose Jaw sits roughly 50 miles west of Regina, at a junction of rivers and rail lines where Cree and Assiniboine peoples had camped and traded for centuries before the CPR arrived in 1882 and transformed a prairie river crossing into a divisional point. The railroad built the city. It brought workers, then settlers, then merchants, then the full apparatus of a small colonial town. Banks, hotels, churches, newspapers, and a Chinatown. Beneath the streets of that Chinatown, it had something else. Something that the city's official record could not fully account for, and still cannot. Here is what is not in dispute. Beneath several blocks of downtown Moose Jaw, there exists a series of interconnected underground passages and rooms. Some of them substantial enough to stand upright in. Some of them narrower, connecting through brick and timber frameworks that were modified repeatedly across decades. They are not rumor. They are not metaphor. You can, if you purchase a ticket from the tourism operation that has occupied a portion of them since the early 1990s, walk through a section yourself. What you cannot do, and this is where the history becomes genuinely contested, is agree on what you are looking at when you do. Two explanations dominate the public conversation about these tunnels. The first involves Chinese workers. The second involves Al Capone. Both have passionate defenders, both have equally passionate detractors, and the archaeology beneath Moose Jaw does not yet fully confirm or fully dismiss either one. Begin with the Chinese story, because it is older, and because it connects to something that was catastrophically real in the world, above the tunnels. By 1885, the Canadian Pacific Railway was complete. The Golden Spike had been driven. The transcontinental line that would, in the ideology of the era, bind a nation together was finished. And the thousands of Chinese workers who had done the most dangerous labor in building it, the workers who had been paid 60 to 70 cents a day compared to the dollar or more earned by their white counterparts, the workers who had died in numbers that were never precisely recorded, but that historians now estimate in the hundreds just in the Fraser Canyon alone. Those workers were suddenly not needed anymore. The Canadian government's response was the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which imposed a $50 head tax on every Chinese person entering Canada. $50 was roughly 2 months' wages for a laborer. Within 15 years, it would be raised to $100. Within 18 years, to $500, a sum that could take years to save. The intent was not subtle. Make continued Chinese immigration economically impossible while reserving the option to import Chinese labor again if it ever became convenient. Make the lives of those Chinese people already in Canada difficult enough that they might leave. They did not leave, or most of them did not. They stayed and built communities in whatever margins the dominant society was willing to leave them. In tight Chinatown districts in Vancouver and Victoria, and in smaller cities like Moose Jaw, where the railway's operational presence had drawn a Chinese community that by the late 1880s included laundries, small restaurants, and the dense networks of mutual aid that made survival possible when the surface world was systematically hostile. The question at the center of the Moose Jaw Tunnel story is whether some of those residents, facing racist violence, police harassment, and the economic exclusion that expressed itself in laws explicitly designed to push them out of sight, built or adapted a series of underground passages beneath the Chinatown district as a way to move through the city without being visible, to conduct business, to shelter people being targeted, to live in a space where the rules of the surface did not apply. The evidence that supports this interpretation is physical, and it is not trivial. There are sections of the tunnel system beneath what was the Chinatown district that show signs of habitation rather than mere utility. Not just passages, but rooms, spaces with evidence of cooking fires, platforms that appear to have been used for sleeping. The kind of accumulated material presence that does not come from storing coal or routing steam pipes. On some of the artifacts recovered from these spaces in the limited archaeological work that has been conducted, pieces of ceramic, buttons, remnants of cloth, are consistent with a Chinese community presence in the late 19th century. There is also the question of the passages themselves. A utility tunnel built to carry steam heat or to allow maintenance workers access to pipes follows certain engineering logic. It goes where the pipes go. It is sized for workers to move through efficiently. It does not branch unnecessarily. Some sections of the Moose Jaw Underground follow these rules. Others do not. There are rooms that a steam heat system has no use for. There are branches that connect spaces with no obvious functional relationship. There are modifications, brickwork laid over earlier brickwork, openings sealed and then unsealed and then sealed again, that suggest a space being adapted over time by people with changing needs, not simply maintained. And there are what investigators who have studied the physical structure most carefully describes as observation points. Small openings in upper walls positioned to allow someone in an underground room to monitor movement at street level without being seen from outside. That is not a feature you put in a boiler room. The people arguing against the habitation story point fairly to the absence of documentary corroboration. No letter, no diary, no official record, no police report from the period explicitly describes Chinese residents living or operating underground in Moose Jaw. The absence of documentation is not proof of absence, especially when the community most likely to have created such documentation had every rational reason to keep its existence off the record. But it is a gap that serious historians are obligated to acknowledge. There is also a timing problem. The sections of tunnel most clearly associated with the documented steam heat utility system can be dated with reasonable confidence to the early 1900s, consistent with the city's known infrastructure development. The sections that show possible signs of earlier or different use are harder to date precisely. The archaeological work on the site has been limited, constrained by the tourism operation that occupies part of the space and has not been managed with full archaeological rigor. Some of the most interesting sections have been modified or partially reconstructed for visitors in ways that complicate interpretation. What this means, honestly, is that the question is not settled. The tunnels existed. Chinese residents of Moose Jaw experienced severe and documented persecution during exactly the relevant period. The physical evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The documentary evidence is absent, but possibly deliberately so. Historians who specialize in Chinese-Canadian history take the core of the story seriously. Historians focused on material evidence of the built environment are more cautious. The answer, if it comes, will require more systematic archaeological investigation than the tunnels have received. Victoria's Chinatown provides some of the clearest physical evidence of what underground survival infrastructure actually looked like in practice. The Fan Tan Alley District, the narrowest commercial street in Canada, its buildings pressing together above a passage barely wide enough for two people to pass, opens at street level into what appears to be a conventional, if compact, commercial block. What extends beneath and behind and between those buildings is a different story. The basements of these buildings were connected by passages, allowing movement between establishments without emerging onto the street. Rooms beneath the basement level of some buildings provided additional space invisible from outside. Some passages ran beneath the alley itself, connecting buildings on opposite sides. The purposes these spaces served evolved as the conditions above them changed. When opium was legal in Canada, which is to say before 1908. Chinese-owned opium businesses operated from basement and semi-subterranean spaces, partly for logistical reasons, partly because the mixed clientele included white Victorians who preferred not to be seen entering a Chinese establishment. After 1908, when the Opium Act criminalized possession and sale, the same spaces that had operated semi-openly became genuinely hidden. The connecting passages that allowed movement between buildings became operationally significant in a different way. Police records from the period describe raids on establishments in Victoria's Chinatown that required simultaneous entry through multiple buildings to be effective. When police entered through the front of one building, occupants and inventory could move through passages to adjacent structures and exit elsewhere. The underground network was a practical countermeasure to the enforcement strategy authorities were using. But opium was only one dimension of the underground's function. Gambling, also criminalized but also in consistent demand from both Chinese and non-Chinese Victorians, was conducted in basement rooms throughout the district. Labor organizing, which faced its own set of legal and social obstacles, used the internal spaces for meetings and coordination that were invisible to the city's surface institutions, and through all of it ran the most basic function: the ability to move, to exist, to conduct daily life without peering on a street where daily life had been made dangerous. Descendants of families who occupied the Fan Tan Alley buildings have in some cases provided detailed accounts of specific passages and their uses. These accounts are not in any official archive because they were never entered there. They exist in family memory, in the occasional recorded interview with an elder, in the patient listening of researchers who understood that the most important documentation of this history was never going to come from a government file. What the physical evidence, carefully read, suggests is a subterranean civic life of considerable sophistication. A city beneath the city, constructed entirely by people whom the official city had decided did not deserve full citizenship, built by hands that had already dug through mountains for a nation that then handed them a bill for the privilege of staying. That is not a romantic story. It is not a story that fits comfortably into the kind of national mythology Canada prefers to tell about itself. It is, however, what the evidence supports. And evidence, as the tunnels themselves demonstrate, has a patience that mythology does not. It is worth dwelling on what the head tax actually meant in practice, because the numbers are so abstract that they can slip past without landing. $500 in 1903, when it was raised to its final and most brutal level. A Chinese laborer in a Canadian city in 1903 might earn between $8 and $15 a month if he could find consistent work in the narrow range of occupations legally available to him. He could not be a pharmacist. He could not be a lawyer. He could not vote, and therefore could not serve on juries, and therefore had no recourse to the legal system that governed the surface world above him. He could do laundry. He could cook. He could garden. He could work construction on jobs that white workers did not want, At $15 a month, saving $500 took 2.5 to 3 years of every cent not spent on survival. During those years, a wife or child left in China could not join him. If he was already in Canada when the act was passed, his family was on the wrong side of a wall that had just been built around him. He could go back, or he could stay and build something in the space that had been left open, which was the space underground. The economic architecture of Chinatown districts in Canadian cities during this period has been studied by historians who specialize in Chinese-Canadian history. And what those studies reveal is a community that developed remarkably sophisticated internal economic systems precisely because the external economy was closed to them. Goods moved between businesses through channels that bypassed the street. Credit was extended through networks of mutual obligation that non-Chinese institutions would not have recognized as credit at all. Labor was allocated through organizations that functioned simultaneously as social clubs, protection societies, and employment agencies. The underground spaces were the physical infrastructure of this parallel economy. They were not an anomaly of the period. They were the period. The built form of a community's response to a society that wanted its labor and not its presence. In Victoria's Fan Tan Alley district, the spatial sophistication of this response becomes most clearly readable in the physical evidence. The buildings that front the alley were, above ground, what a city zoning officer would recognize as mixed commercial properties. Retail, on the ground floor storage, and some residential above. Beneath them was a different kind of city. The passage system connected at least 15 to 20 properties at various points in its history, creating an underground neighborhood with its own internal geography that bore no relationship to the street grid above it. People who lived in these underground spaces, and people did live in them, not as a desperate last resort, but as a deliberate choice in some cases. A way to be below the threshold of official visibility, developed practices that the surface community never documented, but that oral history has partially preserved. You did not light a fire at certain hours, when the smell might carry up through a floor joint to a hostile neighbor. You did not raise your voice. You knew which passages were safe on which days, because certain routes ran under the offices of inspectors or under the patrol paths of police who might notice a sound that didn't belong. This is not the archaeology of poverty. This is the archaeology of strategic adaptation by a community under pressure. There is a crucial difference, and it matters for how we understand what the tunnels represent. Poverty produces underground spaces that are improvised, that lack long-term design, that reflect the immediate material constraints of people with no resources. What the Fan Tan Alley passages show is something else. Long-term planning, repeated modification for changing circumstances, the integration of multiple functions into a single spatial system, observation features that required both engineering knowledge and strategic thinking to design. The people who built these spaces knew what they were doing. They were applying skills, many of them literally acquired while building the tunnels and grade cuts and bridge approaches of the Transcontinental Railway. to a different kind of engineering problem. The problem of survival in a city that had decided they did not belong. The Black communities of southern Ontario, the descendants of freedom seekers who had followed the Underground Railroad north and found a freedom that came with its own set of walls, also built underground infrastructure in the communities they established around Chatham, Dresden, and the shores of Lake Erie. The root cellars and hidden chambers beneath the churches and homes of these communities served, in the years before the American Civil War, the obvious function of concealing people who were still legally property under American laws and subject to capture and return under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. After the Civil War ended American slavery, those same underground spaces were repurposed. They became meeting rooms for organizations that needed to operate with some degree of privacy in a Canada that was, while legally free, not socially welcoming to Black life in the ways that Canadian mythology about being the end of the Underground Railroad preferred to suggest. The physical spaces of the earlier survival network were adapted into the infrastructure of the later community life. The archaeology of those spaces has received even less systematic attention than the Chinese-Canadian underground. The communities are smaller. The geographic distribution is wider, spread across rural Ontario rather than concentrated in urban Chinatown districts where surveys can be targeted. And the historical scholarship on Black Canadian history has been, until very recently, even more thoroughly marginalized in mainstream Canadian historiography than Chinese Canadian history, which was itself already marginal. What unites the Chinese Canadian underground, the Black Canadian underground, and the pre-colonial Indigenous understanding of the underground is a pattern so consistent that it requires explanation at the structural level rather than the case-by-case level. When a society builds its surface for certain people and refuses it to others, the others go below the surface. They do not disappear. They engineer their continued existence in the space that has been left to them, and they do it consistently, with more sophistication than the society that excluded them ever bothered to credit them for. The Capone story arrived in the popular imagination of Moose Jaw somewhat later than the Chinese habitation story, and it has a quality of legend that is harder to disentangle from what the physical record can actually support. The basic claim is that during the Prohibition era of the 1920s, Capone, or his organization, used the Moose Jaw tunnels as part of a bootlegging operation, either as a place to store Canadian liquor before it moved south across the border, or as a personal refuge for Capone himself when things became complicated in Chicago. To understand why this story has traction, you have to understand what was actually happening along the American-Canadian border in the 1920s. Because the factual context is strange enough that it makes almost anything feel possible. Canada's relationship with Prohibition was complicated by design. Some provinces went dry at various points during the 1920s, but the federal government never imposed national prohibition. Canadian distilleries, officially producing spirits for export, continued operating throughout the American dry years. The result was a border that was simultaneously legal on one side and illegal on the other, serviced by an industry that had every financial incentive to exploit the gap and a geography that made comprehensive enforcement essentially impossible. Southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba became significant corridors for liquor moving into the United States. Bootleggers operated networks through these provinces with varying degrees of organization and sophistication. There were also, in Moose Jaw specifically, undocumented connections to organized crime from this period. The city had a reputation for a certain permissiveness toward vice operations, not unique in the era, but notable enough to attract attention. Local politicians and police officers were later found to have accepted payments to look the other way at gambling and liquor operations. Whether those operations extended into the tunnel system is not documented. What is documented is that the underground spaces already existed and were already serving as infrastructure for activities that preferred to avoid visibility. Adding bootlegging to that list of functions would have required no structural modification, and only the kind of arrangement that the surface of Moose Jaw was evidently already comfortable facilitating. The Capone claim specifically rests almost entirely on oral tradition. Stories passed down within certain Moose Jaw families about visitors who arrived discreetly, accounts of underground rooms that were kept unusually well appointed for their location. The timing, at minimum, fits. Capone's organization was actively exploiting Canadian liquor supplies throughout the 1920s. He had business connections in cities along the border, and he did, at various points, need to be somewhere other than Chicago when the law or rival organizations made that desirable. But there is no documentary evidence that Capone personally was ever in Moose Jaw. His known movements during the 1920s, reconstructed by biographers and law enforcement historians who have spent decades on this, do not create an obvious gap where a Saskatchewan sojourn would fit. The FBI files from the period, which have been extensively studied, contain no Moose Jaw reference. This doesn't prove he was never there. Absence from the record is exactly what successful criminals aim for. But it means the claim cannot be confirmed. What is more interesting than the question of whether Capone personally visited is the question of what the Capone story reveals about how underground spaces accumulate narrative over time. The tunnels beneath Moose Jaw are real. The community that built and used them for survival had reasons to leave no record. The bootleggers who may have used them for commerce also had reasons to leave no record. And into the vacuum left by the absence of those records, the most dramatic available story, the one that features the most famous criminal in American history, expands to fill the space. This is a pattern. Underground spaces attract legend, not because they are supernatural, but because they are genuinely under-documented. The darkness beneath a city becomes a screen onto which a culture projects its anxieties, its fascinations, and its preferred stories. Capone is a good story. He is dramatic. He is American. He is the kind of figure that makes a city feel like it has a secret worth keeping. The Chinese Exclusion Act is a different kind of story. It is not dramatic in the way that requires a famous protagonist. It is systematic, bureaucratic. The slow violence of policy rather than the fast violence of guns. It is the kind of story that official tourism operations have historically found easier to put in a footnote than to build a walking tour around. The Moose Jaw Tunnel experience as it currently exists for visitors emphasizes the prohibition narrative significantly more than the persecution narrative. This is a choice, not a malicious one, perhaps, but a choice with consequences for which history gets remembered and which gets submerged again. The physical spaces beneath Moose Jaw do not care which story gets told about them. The brickwork that predates the documented utility system does not announce its own origins. The observation slits cut into upper walls do not explain what they were watching for. The modified passages that branch in directions no engineering logic requires do not label themselves. They simply exist, waiting for questions precise enough and investigators committed enough to deserve answers. The border between legend and history in this story runs through the same space as the border between the documented tunnels and the undocumented ones. Everything on the tourist route has an explanation attached. Everything beyond it is still being argued about, and the argument, for anyone paying attention, is considerably more revealing than the explanation. The Prohibition era underground of Canada has a particular quality of documentation that makes it different from the earlier underground histories we have been examining. It was not entirely undocumented. It was documented by law enforcement, by newspapers, by the courts. From the outside, as something to be suppressed rather than understood. The picture that emerges from that documentation is partial in a specific way. It shows what the authorities chose to pursue and what they were able to catch, which was not the same as what actually existed. What actually existed in the borderland of southern Saskatchewan during the 1920s was a commercial infrastructure of striking sophistication. The geographic reality of the border between Canada and the United States in that region, hundreds of miles of unguarded prairie and farmland, dotted with small towns whose populations were bound together by kinship and mutual economic interest in a way that made official loyalty a flexible concept, made comprehensive enforcement not just difficult, but essentially impossible. The liquor that moved through this landscape moved in ways that ranged from the crudely improvised to the highly organized. Farm trucks with hidden compartments built by local carpenters who asked no questions. Railway cars with false floors signed by conductors who looked the other way in exchange for arrangements that were never written down. Networks of cellars and storage rooms in small-town commercial buildings connected, in some cases by passages that allowed transfer of goods without exposure on the street. The Moose Jaw Tunnel system, whatever else it was or was not, existed in a community where these networks were operating and where the physical infrastructure for underground commerce already existed, in the form of passages that had been built for earlier and different purposes. The question of whether Prohibition-era bootlegging operations used those passages is less interesting than the question of what the passages tell us about the relationship between underground infrastructure and the communities that build and maintain it. Underground spaces are not neutral. They accumulate the character of their use. A passage built to allow Chinese residents to move between buildings without appearing on a hostile street becomes, a decade later, a passage that can allow goods to move between buildings without appearing in the official ledgers of customs enforcement. The spatial function is the same. The community need that the function serves has changed, but the infrastructure remains, and it remains available because someone maintained it, and someone maintained it because it continued to be useful. This is how the Capone legend probably attaches to the Moose Jaw tunnels, even in the absence of documentary evidence that Capone was ever there. The tunnels were real. They were being used for commercial purposes that needed to be invisible. Capone's organization was the dominant force in the supply side of exactly that commerce in the 1920s. The oral tradition that places him in the tunnels may be wrong about the specific individual, while being right about the organizational presence. Capone's network did not require Capone himself to be physically present in every location it operated. It required local partners, local knowledge, and local infrastructure, all of which Moose Jaw demonstrably had. The tourism narrative that has built itself around the Capone connection is not exactly lying. It is selecting the most dramatically satisfying version of a story that has several possible true versions and presenting it as definitive when it is actually speculative. This is not unusual in tourism, but in this particular case, the selection has consequences. The Capone story crowds out the earlier and arguably more important story of the communities that built the tunnels in the first place. Not to hide bootleg whiskey, but to hide themselves. There is something almost ironic in the fact that the Chinese-Canadian community's survival infrastructure became, in its later life, part of the bootlegging trade that American popular culture chose to romanticize. The same passages that allowed people to escape racist violence became passages for escaping customs enforcement. The underground does not discriminate among the needs it serves. It simply serves the needs that the surface refuses to accommodate, whatever those needs happen to be at any given moment. And when the moment passes, when prohibition ends, when the specific combination of persecution and resilience that produced a particular underground space changes, the space does not announce what it was used for. It simply continues to exist, or begins to decay, or gets discovered during a renovation and attributed to whatever the investigators' baseline assumption tells them it was for. Steam heat, bootlegging, nothing of further historical significance. The tunnels beneath Canada do not tell their own stories. That work falls to the people willing to ask the right questions of the right combination of evidence. And as we will see, those questions have been accumulating unanswered for long enough that the answers, when they come, are going to be considerably more complex than the dominant narrative ever suggested. Before any railway, before any Chinatown, before any colonial city laid its grid over the Canadian prairie, or the West Coast rainforest, or the rocky eastern shoreline, the land was known. Not known in the way a map knows a place, with coordinates and elevation lines and property designations. known in the way a language knows a place, which is to say completely and structurally, in the sense that the knowledge is inseparable from the way you understand everything else. The underground was part of that knowledge. This is where the official history of Canada's mysterious underground becomes most difficult to tell responsibly, because it enters a space where the evidence is of kinds that the conventional historical record was never designed to accommodate. The oral traditions of Indigenous nations across Canada contain references to underground spaces that are numerous, specific in ways that are difficult to explain as pure metaphor, and in some cases, corroborated by physical archaeology. They have also been systematically ignored by the historical scholarship that shaped the popular understanding of what is and is not old beneath the Canadian ground. Begin with what archaeology can confirm. The Keatley Creek site in the Fraser Canyon of British Columbia was occupied for roughly 2,000 years. At the height of its occupation, it may have housed more than 1,000 people, living primarily in pit houses, semi-subterranean dwellings with floors set below the ground surface and roof, structures raised above it. Some of these pit houses exceeded 20 meters in diameter. They were not primitive dugouts. They were engineered living spaces built by people who understood how to work with earth and timber to create warm, stable, protected environments in a landscape with extreme temperature variation. The knowledge required to build them was sophisticated and cumulative, transmitted across generations, representing a relationship with the underground that was fundamentally architectural. Underground storage was practiced across virtually every Indigenous culture in Canada, in forms that varied from simple root cellars to elaborate, constructed chambers, designed to maintain specific temperature and humidity conditions for preserving particular food types. Some of these systems were remarkably sophisticated, using the thermal properties of soil to maintain near-constant underground temperatures regardless of surface conditions. The knowledge of where to dig, how deep, how to ventilate, how to seal against moisture. This was specialized knowledge, valuable enough to be transmitted carefully across generations. Then there are the caves. Canada contains thousands of caves, concentrated particularly in British Columbia, Alberta, and parts of Ontario and Quebec, where appropriate geology exists. Many of these caves show evidence of Indigenous use stretching back thousands of years. The Nakimu Caves in Glacier National Park, not formally documented by non-Indigenous researchers until 1904, had been known to Sequay-PMC people for considerably longer. The specific knowledge those peoples carried about the caves, how to navigate them, what they contained, what they were for. That knowledge was not transferred intact to the scientists who later mapped and studied them. This is the recurring structure of the problem. Indigenous peoples knew things about the underground landscape of Canada that took non-Indigenous researchers decades or centuries to rediscover, if they rediscovered them at all. The knowledge transmission was broken, often deliberately. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose territories historically encompassed much of what is now southern Ontario and Quebec, carry traditions about underground passages connecting significant sites in their landscape. These are not esoteric or marginal traditions. They are embedded in core cultural narratives about how people moved through the land, how sacred sites were connected, how certain kinds of knowledge were protected by being conducted underground, away from the surface world, where it could be observed and interfered with. The Blackfoot peoples of the northern Great Plains carry traditions that describe underground spaces in specific geographic areas with a specificity that is difficult to account for as pure metaphor. Some describe passages that are not natural cave formations but shaped spaces, intentional underground constructions associated with particular ceremonial and social purposes. The Anishinaabe nations, whose traditional territories stretch across the Great Lakes region and into the boreal forest, have oral traditions about underground spaces that some scholars have begun reading not only as spiritual narrative, but as encoded geographic memory. Places where people went underground. Places that were connected through passages to other places. Places that required specific knowledge to find and to use safely. The difficulty, and it is a real difficulty, not a rhetorical one, is that these traditions were transmitted in contexts that the colonial project actively destroyed. Residential schools removed children from their communities for decades and forbade the transmission of traditional knowledge. The outlawing of ceremonies like the potlatch and the Sundance, suppressed under Canadian law from 1885 to 1951, interrupted the formal contexts in which geographic and historical knowledge was transmitted. Languages were suppressed, and with them the specific terms and concepts that would have allowed the most precise oral transmission of spatial and historical information. What survived in fragments. And when those fragments surfaced in conversation with non-Indigenous scholars, they were frequently categorized as mythology rather than history. That analytical move told the scholar considerably more about their own assumptions than about the traditions they were hearing. The observer problem has a specific shape in this context. The people who studied Canadian landscapes in the first serious wave of 20th century scholarship were working from documents, papers, land records, geological surveys, the accumulated paper trail of colonial administration. They were not, for the most part, working from the knowledge systems that had organized understanding of those same landscapes for thousands of years before any document existed. When anomalies appeared, geological formations that didn't quite fit the standard explanatory frameworks, cave systems whose full extent or cultural significance exceeded what the scientific record captured, underground spaces whose age and purpose resisted explanation. The frameworks available to analyze them were simply not adequate to the task. Not because the researchers were incompetent, because they were using the wrong tools. This is not a peripheral problem. It is the center of the problem. The most genuinely unexplained underground spaces in Canada sit at the intersection of geological anomaly and deep Indigenous knowledge of a landscape, in an investigative void created by inadequate resources, inadequate collaboration, and a century and a half of scientific practice that treated indigenous knowledge as irrelevant to geological inquiry. What lives in that void is not ancient aliens or lost civilizations. What lives there is a serious scholarly question that has not yet been seriously asked with the right combination of tools, knowledge, and openness to what the answer might be. In the Caribou region of British Columbia, there are passages in certain cliff formations that have been observed by hikers and climbers whose geological training is sufficient to recognize that the passages do not look like the natural processes that shaped the surrounding rock. The openings are too regular, the floors are too level, the corners are too sharp, without more systematic investigation, which the rugged terrain makes logistically difficult. The explanation for these spaces remains genuinely open. In northern Ontario, in rock country that has been occupied by Anishinaabe peoples for thousands of years, there are occasional reports from mining operations of underground spaces whose character doesn't match the documented geology of the area. Mining engineers who encounter an anomalous underground space in the course of drilling are not prone to romanticizing it. When some of them say that a particular space doesn't look natural, that observation deserves to be taken seriously. But mining companies are not in the business of archaeological investigation, and they have practical incentives to process anomalies quickly and move on. The potential connection between the oral traditions that describe specific underground spaces and the physical anomalies that have been independently reported in the same geographic areas has not been systematically investigated. Doing so would require the kind of sustained, respectful, genuinely collaborative work between Indigenous knowledge holders and earth scientists that has rarely been adequately resourced or institutionally supported. The Sequapem, who could describe the geography of the Nakimu caves before the first non-Indigenous person entered them, knew something real. The Blackfoot oral tradition that describes underground passages in the Alberta foothills is describing something. Whether that something is a literal constructed passage, a natural geological feature known through deep familiarity, or a spatial reality that doesn't map onto either of those categories. That is the question. And it will require sustained collaboration to approach honestly. That collaboration is beginning. It is not moving quickly. The damage done by a century and a half of colonial scholarship that treated Indigenous knowledge as mythology is not reversed in a generation. But the conversations are happening, and in some cases, they are producing discoveries that the conventional tools of archaeology would not have found on their own. In the meantime, anyone who wants to understand what is truly mysterious about the tunnels beneath Canada has to start by taking seriously a knowledge tradition about the underground that predates every building, every railway, every colonial map by a minimum of thousands of years, not because it is romantic to do so, because the evidence taken seriously requires it. The relationship between Indigenous peoples and the underground of North America is a subject that Western scholarship has consistently approached with the wrong tools. The tools available: archaeological stratigraphy in carbon dating, geological survey, the analysis of material culture, are powerful within their domains. They are not adequate on their own to the kind of knowledge that has been carried in oral tradition across generations, encoded in language, maintained in ceremony, and transmitted through relationships between teachers and students in ways that formal academic disciplines have not been designed to receive. Consider the specific case of pit house technology. The semi-subterranean dwellings of interior British Columbia represent a technical achievement that took centuries to develop and optimize. The precise depth at which to set the floor, deep enough for thermal stability, shallow enough for adequate ventilation and emergency egress, the angle and orientation of the entry passage to minimize heat loss while allowing smoke to escape, the ratio of diameter to height in the roof structure to balance load-bearing capacity against living space, the species of timber to use for the posts that would bear the greatest loads. None of this knowledge appeared suddenly. It was accumulated across generations through a process of observation, experimentation, failure, and refinement that is, in its essential character, indistinguishable from what we would now call engineering research. When European observers in the 19th century first encountered pit house villages in the British Columbia interior, the descriptions they produced consistently used the language of primitiveness. Holes in the ground, crude shelters, evidence of a people who had not yet advanced to the stage of building permanent structures. This language reveals more about the observers than about what they were observing. A pit house village of the kind documented at Keatley Creek, housing 1,000 or more people in structures engineered for the specific thermal and social conditions of the plateau environment, is not a primitive shelter. It is a sophisticated architectural response to a specific set of environmental and social requirements. The knowledge required to build and maintain those villages was not written down, because writing was not the technology available for its transmission. It was held in practice, in oral instruction, in the embodied knowledge of the builders who had learned by building alongside those who knew. When that transmission was disrupted by epidemic, by forced relocation, by residential schooling, the loss was not just cultural in the abstract sense. It was technical. Specific engineering knowledge about how to work with specific materials in specific conditions disappeared, in some cases, irreversibly. What makes this relevant to the question of Canada's underground mysteries is that the people who held this knowledge were also the people with the deepest and most intimate familiarity with the landscape that later became the substrate for Canadian cities. They knew where the water moved underground. They knew where the rock was stable and where it was not. They knew which geological formations had spaces in them, natural or modified, and what those spaces had been used for and why. When archaeologists and geologists now encounter underground anomalies in areas of long Indigenous occupation, they are frequently working without access to this knowledge. The anomaly is real. The records that might explain it, if explanation is even the right frame rather than understanding, are held by communities that have been systematically excluded from the research process. In some regions of Canada, this is beginning to change. The concept of two-eyed seeing, developed by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, offers a framework for integrating indigenous knowledge with Western science in ways that neither displaces nor subordinates the other. Researchers working under this framework in various parts of Atlantic and central Canada have found that indigenous knowledge about specific landscapes consistently anticipates and sometimes exceeds what Western scientific methods can independently determine. Applied to the question of underground spaces, this framework suggests that the oral traditions of various nations about specific underground locations are not myths to be tested against physical evidence, but rather a different kind of physical evidence. Evidence of landscape knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation and transmission. When those traditions describe an underground space, the question for the researcher is not whether to believe it, but how to bring the physical investigative tools to bear in ways that can add to, rather than substitute for, that existing knowledge. The practical obstacles to this kind of work are significant. Funding for collaborative research that does not fit neatly into existing disciplinary categories is difficult to secure. The institutional structures of universities and research organizations are not well designed for the kind of long-term, trust-based relationships that genuine collaboration requires. Indigenous communities, understandably wary after a century and a half of having their knowledge extracted and misrepresented by academic institutions, approach new collaborative proposals with appropriate caution. But the work is happening, and in some cases, the results are striking enough that they are changing the terms of the conversation about what the underground of Canada actually contains and how old its human history actually is. The picture that emerges from the intersection of Indigenous oral knowledge, geophysical survey, and careful archaeological investigation is one in which the ground beneath Canada has been known, worked, lived in, ceremonially engaged with, and remembered across a time scale that makes the colonial period look like a very recent footnote. The colonial period is the footnote. The Indigenous relationship with this land is the text. And the underground, which has been dismissed as uninteresting because the colonial record found nothing interesting to say about it, turns out to be, in some respects, the most interesting part of the text. There is a citadel in Halifax that sits on a hill above the harbor. Its star-shaped earthen walls are visible from most of the city. And inside and beneath those walls is a tunnel system that is documented, mapped, partially open to visitors, and still not fully understood. This seems like a contradiction. How can something be documented and still not fully understood? The answer tells you something important about the relationship between official record-keeping and actual historical reality. A relationship that turns out to be considerably less reliable than official record-keeping would prefer you to believe. Halifax Citadel was constructed in various phases beginning in the 1750s, though the current structure dates primarily from work done between 1828 and 1856. As the primary military fortification defending Halifax Harbour, it served as the operational heart of British military presence in Atlantic Canada for over a century and a half. Its tunnel system is substantial. Underground magazines, connecting passages, sally ports, ammunition storage chambers built into the earthworks in ways consistent with the military engineering of their period. The documented portions of this system have been studied by military historians and are part of the Parks Canada interpretation. They are not mysterious in the conventional sense. You can read about them in academic papers and walk through some of them on a guided tour. But the Citadel also has sections that are not open to the public, and the documentation of what exists in those sections is not complete in publicly available records. Military engineers working in the 20th century added modifications and extensions to the 19th century system that were not entered into records that have been made fully available. Some of the deeper or more peripheral sections of the tunnel complex have not been comprehensively surveyed in the modern era. The simple fact of a well-documented military structure does not mean that everything within it has been documented. This is a pattern that repeats at military sites across Canada. Fort Henry in Kingston, Ontario sits at the confluence of the St. Lawrence River and the Rideau Canal, at a position of obvious strategic importance that was fortified beginning in the early 19th century. The current Fort Henry structure, completed in 1836, has an extensive system of underground passages and chambers. Like Halifax Citadel, the fort also has sections that have not been fully surveyed in recent decades, and full extent of the connecting passages between various parts of the fortification remains incompletely mapped in publicly available sources. These are not mysteries in the conspiratorial sense. Nobody is hiding anything nefarious in the tunnels under Fort Henry. But the habit of treating documented military infrastructure as fully understood because it is documented is one that the physical evidence repeatedly undermines. Buildings are modified, tunnels are extended, connections are added, chambers are sealed. All of this happens over decades and centuries, and the administrative records that capture it are uneven in their completeness and availability. The Rideau Canal deserves particular attention here. Built between 1826 and 1832 under Lieutenant Colonel Connell John By of the Royal Engineers, the canal was constructed specifically as a military supply route that would allow movement of troops and material between Montreal and Kingston without exposure to American attack along the St. Lawrence. Its locks, dams, and associated infrastructure required significant earthworks. At several locations, construction involved excavation of tunnels and chambers to house lock mechanisms and allow maintenance access. At Bytown, which became Ottawa, the northern terminus of the canal involved the excavation of a sandstone ridge. This excavation created the Rideau Canal locks, still operational today, and also created a series of chambers and passages within the stone that were used for various purposes over the following decades. These spaces have been studied, but their full extent and the history of their use over nearly 2 centuries is not comprehensively documented. Ottawa itself adds another layer. As the national capital, Ottawa has served for over 150 years as the operational heart of the Canadian government. The Parliament Hill complex and surrounding government buildings have accumulated underground connections, tunnels, and infrastructure that reflect both the practical needs of managing a large governmental campus and the security concerns of various periods. The tunnels connecting various federal buildings in the parliamentary precinct are not entirely secret, but they are not entirely public either. Security concerns have limited documentation of what exists and where it runs. Modifications made during periods of heightened security. The two world wars, the Cold War, and various security incidents of more recent decades are not reflected in any comprehensive public record. This is where the military underground history of Canada begins to shade into the category of things that are not truly unknown to relevant authorities, but are genuinely not part of the public historical record. There is a difference between mysterious and classified, and some of what exists beneath Canadian government buildings falls into the latter category. But classified information left in that state long enough and across enough institutional transitions can effectively become mysterious even to the officials nominally responsible for the spaces. The most extreme example of this dynamic in Canadian history is not in Ottawa, though Ottawa has its own version of it. The most extreme example is a former military installation 60 kilometers west of the capital, where during the late 1950s, the Government of Canada dug a hole in the Carp Valley and built something that was not acknowledged publicly for decades. In 1958, excavation began on a 4-story underground structure. The workers who built it knew they were building something for the government. They did not know what. The local residents who noticed construction activity had their questions deflected or simply not answered. When the structure was complete in 1961, it contained a war operations room, a CBC broadcasting studio, a miniature hospital, a decontamination facility, sleeping quarters for 535 people, and an emergency communications system capable of operating independently of the national telephone network. It was designed to house the federal cabinet, the Bank of Canada's gold reserves, and senior military and civilian leadership in the event of nuclear attack. The walls were reinforced concrete, multiple meters thick. The blast doors were designed to withstand pressures that would obliterate any conventional structure above ground. It came to be called the Diefenbunker, after Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, though that nickname arrived later and with a sardonic edge. The public's eventual reaction to the revelation that such a facility had existed, and that the plan for nuclear survival apparently involved saving the cabinet while offering very little to everyone else, was not warm. The Diefenbunker is now a museum. You can buy a ticket and walk through it. Read the interpretive panels, see the recreated operations room and the blast doors. This openness is genuinely useful for understanding what the Cold War government was thinking about catastrophe. But the Diefenbunker was not the only such facility. It was not even the primary one. The Canadian government's Cold War emergency planning infrastructure included a network of what were called Emergency Government Headquarters, or EGHQs, distributed across the country, at least one, in each province, in locations chosen for geological stability, reasonable distance from likely nuclear targets, and discretion. These facilities varied in size and sophistication, from relatively modest converted structures to purpose-built underground installations similar in kind to the Diefenbunker, if smaller in scale. They were designed to house provincial governments and key personnel in the event that the main urban centers were destroyed. Some of these facilities have been decommissioned and are now known to researchers and historians. Others have been demolished. Some are documented only in archival records that require considerable persistence to locate and interpret. And a few, particularly those associated with communications and intelligence functions, rather than simple governmental continuity, remain in a documentary gray zone, acknowledged to exist in general terms, but not fully described in any public record. The existence of this network is not conspiracy theory. It is documented government policy reflected in federal and provincial emergency management records from the 1950s through the 1980s. What is less fully documented is the physical specifics, exactly where each facility was, what it contained, how it was modified over the decades, and what happened to it afterward. Decommissioning records are incomplete. Some facilities were sold to private owners without the full history of what was in the ground being disclosed. Some were handed to municipalities or provincial governments with documentation that was, charitably speaking, not comprehensive. The communications dimension adds its own layer. Canada's Cold War military communications network required a physical infrastructure of underground cables, relay stations, and protected facilities that extended across the country. Some of this infrastructure was shared with the broader North American network, coordinated through agreements with the United States military. Some of it was distinctly Canadian. Some of it was built in collaboration with British intelligence services under agreements that remain partially classified. This is not the romantic mystery of hidden treasure or ancient civilization. It is the more mundane and in some ways more troubling mystery of a democratic government's relationship with its own citizens during a period of genuine existential fear. The Cold War underground of Canada is the physical record of decisions made in secret by officials who genuinely believed they were acting in the national interest, about what would be saved and what would be sacrificed in the event of nuclear war. That those decisions were never submitted to democratic deliberation. That the physical infrastructure recording them was built without public knowledge and in many cases dismantled without public accounting. That is a historical fact that the available documentation only partially captures. The institutional amnesia of the classified state has its own archaeology. Facilities repurposed without their history being disclosed. Tunnels that end at doors no one can explain on current maps. Infrastructure that appears in one set of records and not in others, in ways that suggest not accidental omission but deliberate removal. Finding those traces requires a different kind of patience from the patience required to read charcoal layers in a prairie basement. But the structure of the problem is not so different. Something was here. Something happened. The record of it was incomplete by design, and the physical evidence, carefully read, can sometimes say more than the documents were permitted to. There is a particular kind of bureaucratic forgetting that is different from the ordinary kind. The ordinary kind happens when records are lost in fires, or when paper degrades in flooded archives, or when institutional priorities shift and certain files are not digitized when others are. This kind of forgetting is regrettable, but not exactly culpable. It is the entropy of administration. The bureaucratic forgetting associated with Canada's Cold War infrastructure is different. It is the forgetting that happens when an institution deliberately chooses not to create a comprehensive record in the first place, or creates a comprehensive record and then classifies it in ways that make it effectively inaccessible, or decommissions a facility in ways that transfer liability without transferring knowledge. This forgetting has intention behind it, even when the individual bureaucrats participating in it are simply following procedures and not thinking of themselves as participants in any deliberate erasure. The National Emergency Government Headquarters Network is a case study in this kind of institutional amnesia. The network was real. It was funded by public money. It was designed to serve a public purpose, the continuity of democratic government in the event of catastrophic attack. And yet the public was never told it existed, never consulted about whether it should exist, never given the opportunity to discuss the assumption embedded in its design that in the event of nuclear war, the survival of the cabinet was more important than the survival of any other particular group of Canadians. That assumption is worth examining even now. The Diefenbunker and its provincial equivalents were designed to house roughly 500 people at the federal level and smaller numbers at the provincial level. Canada's population in 1961 was approximately 18 million people. The mathematics of who gets saved and who does not, the mathematics that was built into the physical's design of the bunkers, was a political decision of profound consequence. It was made without any public debate, by officials who decided that the public did not need to be part of the conversation about its own survival. The Cold War context makes this comprehensible, if not exactly defensible. The logic of nuclear deterrence required, or at least seemed to require, that certain kinds of information be kept from public knowledge, including information about what the government actually planned to do if deterrence failed. Telling the public that the plan involved saving the cabinet and the Bank of Canada's gold, while offering no equivalent provision for ordinary citizens, would have been, from the government's perspective, both politically catastrophic and strategically inadvisable. But the secrecy did not end when the Cold War ended. The decommissioning of the EGHQ network, which began in the late 1980s and continued through the 1990s, was not accompanied by the kind of public accounting that would have allowed Canadians to understand what had been built in their name and what it had cost, and what it had been intended to do. Some facilities were simply closed. Some were sold. Some were transferred to other government bodies without their history being disclosed in the transfer documents. The result is a patchwork of institutional knowledge in which some former EGHQ sites are well documented in archival sources, accessible to researchers with the persistence to find them. Some are known only through local rumors and the recollections of people who worked on their construction or maintenance, and some appear to have fallen through the cracks of the decommissioning process in ways that make their current status genuinely unclear. There are also, almost certainly, facilities that have not been publicly identified at all. The classification level of certain Cold War infrastructure projects was high enough that their existence may not have been entered into any record that subsequent declassification reviews have surfaced. When the documents that describe a facility are themselves classified at a level that ensures they will not be reviewed in any standard declassification cycle, the facility can effectively disappear from the institutional memory of the government that built it. This is not speculation. It is the documented history of Cold War secrecy practices in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, all of which participated in shared infrastructure projects under agreements that cross-classified documents at different levels in each country's security apparatus. Recovering a complete picture of what those agreements produced on Canadian soil would require a level of multinational archival cooperation that has not occurred. What the classified state underground adds to the broader story of Canada's hidden ground is a particular kind of irony. The communities that were forced underground by state persecution, the Chinese Canadians, the Black Canadians, the Indigenous peoples displaced from their own underground knowledge, built their underground in defiance of the state. The state that persecuted them went underground itself, secretly, with far greater resources for its own protection. The surface that was denied to the persecuted was claimed by the persecutors. And then the persecutors went underground too when the surface became dangerous enough. There is something in that pattern that says something true about power and its relationship to visibility. The powerful claim the surface as long as the surface is safe. When the surface becomes unsafe, they retreat to the underground that they built in secret, while publicly maintaining that they had nothing to hide. The underground is always available as a refuge. The question is only who gets to use it, and who builds it, and who gets to know it exists. To understand why so much of Canada's underground history remains unknown, you have to think about what happens to a tunnel when no one uses it for 50 years. The answer is instructive and a little melancholy. Tunnels are not passive structures. Unlike a stone building that can stand empty for centuries, a tunnel requires continuous maintenance to retain its character as a usable space. The earth around it is always moving in small ways. Frost heave pushes walls inward through the Canadian winter. Spring water seeps through mortar joints that were never designed to hold forever. Tree roots find cracks and follow them patiently, year by year, exerting a force that no brick construction was designed to resist indefinitely. Without someone regularly checking, shoring up, repointing mortar, clearing drainage, the tunnel begins to change. First subtly, a slight inward lean of a wall, a crack in the ceiling that lets a thin line of soil through, a floor that begins to hold water after heavy rain. Then, more noticeably, then in a decade or two, fundamentally, wooden tunnel supports. The kind used in the 19th century, treated with whatever preservation technology was available at the time, can lose structural integrity in 10 to 20 years when in contact with soil and periodic moisture. Once the support fails, the surrounding soil shifts to fill the available space. A timber-framed passage might, within a human generation of abandonment, become a zone of compressed and disturbed earth, whose only remaining evidence is a slight linear depression on the surface, above, or an area of soft ground that doesn't match its surroundings, or a signature visible only to ground-penetrating radar, a zone of different density in the soil profile. Brick-constructed passages last longer, decades rather than years before catastrophic structural failure. But in the wet-dry cycles of Canadian seasonal extremes, they are particularly vulnerable to freeze-thaw. Water that enters a brick joint expands by approximately 9% when it freezes. In cold climates, that expansion and contraction repeated hundreds of times across the life of a wall eventually defeats the mortar. Sections of brick displace. Walls bow. The vault that holds the ceiling up loses its compression, and the ceiling comes down. What remains after this process has run for 50 or 100 years is often difficult to distinguish from naturally disturbed soil and rock. The excavator's eye, trained to look for the straight line and the right angle and the manufactured surface that signals human construction, can sometimes see through the disturbance to the original intention of a space. More often, without additional tools, it cannot. In urban Canada, the process of built-over forgetting is faster still. When a building above a tunnel system is demolished and replaced, the construction process for the new structure commonly involves excavation that destroys any tunnel features immediately below the demolished footprint. The new building's foundations press down through whatever existed before. The contractor follows the plan. Anomalous spaces found during construction are a problem to be solved, not a mystery to be preserved. They are filled, reinforced, or avoided, and the paperwork generated describes them functionally rather than historically. The cumulative effect of this process across a century of urban development in Canadian cities has been substantial. Every block of downtown Moose Jaw, Victoria, Halifax, and Ottawa that has seen a building demolished and replaced in the last 100 years has potentially had underground history destroyed in the process. The pace of that destruction accelerated during the urban renewal era of the 1960s and 1970s, when large blocks of older buildings were cleared for new development, often in exactly the areas where the most historically significant underground spaces were most likely to exist. The heritage protection frameworks that might have preserved some of this history did not, for the most part, treat underground spaces as heritage assets. Above-ground historic buildings were a recognized category, with legal frameworks for protection. Underground spaces, with rare exceptions, were not. And the communities whose underground heritage was being destroyed did not, until relatively recently, have the political standing to advocate effectively for its preservation. The indigenous dimension of this forgetting is, as in every other aspect of this story, its own and more profound form of loss. When sacred or significant underground spaces in indigenous territories were destroyed by development, there was rarely any mechanism to document what was lost before it was gone. The knowledge of what those spaces were and why they mattered existed in oral tradition and in the knowledge of specific people. Knowledge that was not solicited by the development process and was not entered into any compensating record. The combination of physical destruction and the parallel destruction of the knowledge frameworks within which those spaces had meaning represents a kind of double erasure that standard archival methods cannot easily address. What this means in practice for the researcher trying to understand Canada's underground is a series of investigative strategies that are uncomfortably indirect. You look for the traces most resistant to destruction. Charcoal persists, ceramics persist, metal artifacts persist. The distinctive chemical signature of human habitation. Elevated phosphorus from organic waste decomposition, charcoal fragments, altered pH, changes in microbial communities that reflect past disturbance, persists in the soil even when the physical structure that created those conditions is long gone. These geochemical traces can be detected by careful sampling and laboratory analysis. And they can, in some cases, place human habitation in a location and approximate time period, even when every physical structure associated with that habitation has been destroyed. Ground-penetrating radar sends pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and measures the reflections that return from boundaries between materials of different density. It can detect the void left by a collapsed tunnel even after the tunnel has filled with disturbed soil. The soil that falls into a collapsed tunnel differs in compaction and composition from the undisturbed soil around it, and that difference persists for decades or centuries. A trained interpreter looking at a ground-penetrating radar profile can identify probable former tunnel locations, even in the absence of any physical access. These methods have been applied to some Canadian urban sites, and the results are suggestive in ways that warrant follow-up investigation. In some downtown blocks where oral history and documentary evidence suggest underground spaces existed, ground-penetrating radar surveys have produced anomalies consistent with collapsed or filled tunnel features. Those anomalies have not, in most cases, been followed up with excavation to confirm or disprove the interpretation. The resources for that kind of work are not routinely available, and the institutional will to pursue questions that might produce historically uncomfortable answers is not always present. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, the same technology that revealed geoglyphs beneath the Amazon canopy, is being applied to urban environments and Canadian landscapes with results that are sometimes unexpected. In applications focused on pre-colonial settlement patterns, LiDAR is revealing surface modifications that correspond to areas identified in Indigenous oral tradition as significant places, some of which have underground components that subsequent excavation has confirmed. In Victoria, researchers affiliated with the University of Victoria and the University of British Columbia have been working with community organizations from the Chinese Canadian community to map surviving underground features in and around the Fantan Alley district. The combination of oral history, archival research, and geophysical surveying has produced a partial map of the passage system that is considerably more extensive than what the tourism literature acknowledges. Some sections assumed to have been destroyed by 20th century development appear to have survived in modified form. Others not previously known to researchers have been identified through the geophysical work. The collaborative model matters here. The geophysical survey without the oral history produces anomalies without context, blobs of different density in the ground that might or might not be tunnel-related. The oral history without the geophysical survey remains unverifiable tradition. Together, they produce something neither could achieve alone: a physically grounded account of a community's spatial history that has the credibility of corroborated evidence. In Moose Jaw, similar work has begun, though it has proceeded more slowly and with less institutional support. Researchers working independently of the tourism operation have conducted preliminary surveys and archival work, suggesting that the documented section of tunnel is smaller than the full system that existed, and that sections whose existence is supported by oral tradition have physical correlates detectable by non-invasive survey. The revised map that is emerging, even in its incomplete form, tells a story consistently different from the official account in one key respect. It shows more spatial extent, more complexity, more evidence of purposeful design than the official narrative has acknowledged. Whether that more will eventually resolve the most genuinely mysterious questions, whether it will explain the anomalous sections of the Moose Jaw tunnels, whether it will corroborate Indigenous oral traditions about underground passages in ways the physical record can confirm, whether it will reveal Cold War infrastructure whose existence has been quietly denied, is not yet clear. But the direction of the evidence is consistent. The official account underestimated the underground. The physical evidence, read with adequate tools and adequate humility, is larger and stranger and more human than the official account ever allowed it to be. If you step back from all of this, the radar profiles and the pottery shards and the oral traditions and the archival gaps and the Cold War bunkers and the Chinatown passages, and let the pieces settle into some kind of coherence, a different Canada begins to emerge from beneath the one on the official maps. Not a secret Canada in the conspiratorial sense, not a land of hidden treasures and ancient mysteries that resolves into a dramatic revelation. Something stranger and more human than that. A Canada whose underground is layered with purposes and peoples that the surface narrative has consistently underestimated, where stone and clay and timber beneath the cities hold the residue of communities that were told they had no place on the surface, and who responded with ingenuity and practical courage by building their place below it, where the rock of the shield and the limestone of the mountain country preserve both the geological memory of an ancient continent and the cultural memory of peoples whose knowledge of that rock runs back thousands of years in forms that no colonial document ever adequately captured, where the government of a democratic country dug its own secrets into the earth and has not even now given a full account of what it put there. The tunnels beneath Canada do not point to a single story. They point to several stories, connected not by a shared author, but by a shared dynamic. The underground across all of these histories is where people go when the surface excludes them. It is the space that remains when all the sanctioned spaces have been claimed. The Chinese workers who built the most dangerous sections of the transcontinental railway and then found themselves legally excluded from the country they had helped to construct. They understood the underground in both senses, the literal space beneath the city that was available when the surface was not, and the metaphorical underground of an existence that the official economy and the official culture required to be invisible. What they built in that space was not merely a hiding place. It was a community infrastructure, a parallel civic life conducted below the threshold of official visibility. The indigenous nations whose knowledge of this land, including its underground, stretches back thousands of years before any colonial map was drawn. They understood that the distinction between surface and underground, between what is visible and what is hidden, is a distinction that the land itself does not make. The karst systems of British Columbia, the sacred caves of the Shield, the pit house villages of the interior plateau, the oral traditions about underground passages that non-Indigenous scholars have been so slow to take seriously. All of these represent a relationship with the underground more intimate and more ancient than anything the colonial period produced. The government that built its emergency bunkers and its communication tunnels and its continuity of government infrastructure in the anxious decades of the Cold War, and then declined to give a full, public account of what it had built and why. Even governments, it turns out, sometimes go underground when the surface seems too exposed, when the visibility that democratic governance requires feels like a liability in the face of existential threat. And then there are the genuinely unexplained things, the geological anomalies that don't fit the standard frameworks, sections of tunnel whose age and purpose remain contested, the physical evidence that corroborates oral traditions in ways that the existing investigative tools cannot fully resolve. These are not fabrications. They are the residue of genuine complexity in a landscape that has been deeply and repeatedly inhabited by peoples whose knowledge of it has not been adequately incorporated into the investigation. The Amazon rainforest, in the earlier scripts of this kind of inquiry, was not an untouched wilderness. It was a landscape remembered, a forest that had been worked by millions of hands and then abandoned and then overgrown, and then systematically misread by observers who could not see past their own assumptions about what significant human presence looked like. The underground of Canada is not the Amazon, but the pattern of misreading is similar. The assumption that nothing significant was happening in a space because the evidence of what was happening is not legible to the available frameworks has distorted the account in ways that are only now being corrected. The correction is slow, incomplete, not yet institutionally supported in the way the question deserves. But it is happening, somewhere beneath Moose Jaw, past the documented section of tunnel that the tourism operation controls. A passage runs in a direction that the steam heat utility maps do not explain. A brick wall faces a timber support that has been dated to a decade before the official record says the tunnel system was built. A ceramic fragment from the 1890s sits in soil disturbed by human activity in ways that don't match the documented industrial use of the space. Somewhere beneath Victoria's inner harbor, below the silt of a century of development, there may be the remnants of a passage system whose full extent was never mapped and whose history was never entered into any file a researcher will easily find. Somewhere in the Canadian Shield, in a valley known to Anishinaabe peoples by a name that encodes information about the underground that no geologist has yet thought to ask about, there is a formation that does not match the documented geology of the surrounding rock. Somewhere in a decommissioned facility in a small Ontario township. The rooms designed to house a government in the aftermath of a war that did not happen are still there, their history partially told and partially not. The tunnels do not speak in our language. They do not announce their significance or explain their purposes. They simply persist or fail to persist in the ways that stone and brick and timber and soil allow or require. And they wait for the questions to become precise enough, and the tools to become adequate enough, and the collaborative relationships between the people who know different pieces of the story to become sufficiently trusting that the questions can finally be answered. Some of those answers are close. The ground-penetrating radar is getting better. The archival work is getting more careful. The collaborations between Indigenous scholars and earth scientists are producing results that neither could have reached alone. The Chinese-Canadian historical community has been patient and persistent in ways that are beginning to change the institutional framework what counts as evidence. Other answers are further away, or may not come at all. Some tunnels have been destroyed beyond reconstruction. Some knowledge was lost with the people who held it, and no technology will recover it. Some institutional records will remain classified long enough that whatever context would make them interpretable will itself have become historical. But the underground of Canada is not, and has never been, as empty as the official story required it to be. What was built down there by the excluded and the persecuted, and the ingenious and the fearful and the ancient, is part of this country's real history. The history that happens in the spaces that official maps do not show. The history that is conducted below the threshold of the visible, by people whose existence the surface was designed to ignore. That history is in the ground, And the ground, as it turns out, has a very long memory. If these tunnels have settled into your thinking tonight, if the idea of an underground that holds more than the official map suggests has taken root in the way that certain ideas do, then you might already be asking a version of the right question, not the dramatic version, not what treasure is hidden, the quieter one, the one that actually has answers waiting behind it. Whose history is this? Who built it? Why didn't we know? The next time you walk a street in any North American city, let yourself wonder, just briefly, what might be below the concrete? What purposes the darkness there has served? Whose hands shaped those spaces? Whose lives were conducted in them? The ground beneath you is not blank, it remembers. And if you listen in the right way, with enough patience, and enough willingness to hear what the official story left out, it will tell you things that are stranger and more human and more important than anything on the map above it. Good night. Sleep well. The tunnels will still be there in the morning. The African-Canadian underground deserves its own extended examination here, because it demonstrates the pattern most clearly in a context that American audiences are most familiar with, even if they are not familiar with the Canadian chapter of the story. The Underground Railroad, as it is taught in American schools, ends at the Canadian border. Freedom seekers cross the line into Canada, and the story is over. They are safe. The narrative closes. What happens next is not usually part of the curriculum, and what happens next is, in some ways, the more instructive part of the story. What happened next is that freedom seekers arrived in communities that were free in the legal sense and hostile in most other senses. The black settlements of southwestern Ontario, Chatham, Dresden, Buxton, Windsor, Amherstburg, were communities where people built lives with extraordinary resourcefulness in the face of persistent social exclusion. They built churches, they built schools, they founded newspapers, they organized politically, and they built or adapted underground spaces that served the immediate function of concealment and the longer-term function of community infrastructure. The Buxton Settlement, established in 1849 by the Reverend William King as a planned community for freedom seekers, developed a physical infrastructure that included underground storage and concealment spaces built into the basements of the community's original structures. Some of these spaces have been partially excavated by archaeologists working with community organizations, and the material evidence they have produced is consistent with the oral tradition that describes them as serving multiple functions: food storage, concealment of people still being pursued under the Fugitive Slave Act, and later gathering spaces for organizations that needed some degree of privacy from the white-dominated civic structures of the surrounding region. What makes the Buxton case particularly interesting from an archaeological perspective is that the community's records are unusually well preserved. Compared to most marginalized community archives from the same period, the settlement kept records of land ownership, of school enrollment, of agricultural production, in ways that reflect the community's understanding that documentation was a form of political protection. And those records, combined with the physical evidence from archaeological investigation, create an unusually coherent picture of how underground space was integrated into the daily life of a community that could not take the surface for granted. The parallel with the Chinese-Canadian communities of the same period is striking. Even though the two communities had no direct connection and were responding to different specific forms of exclusion, both built underground infrastructure as a practical response to the denial of surface access. Both integrated that infrastructure into broader community, economic, and social systems. Both produced underground spaces that the dominant historical narrative subsequently either ignored or reduced to a single dramatic function. Concealment of fugitives in one case, concealment of opium in the other, without acknowledging the more complex and more interesting reality of what those spaces actually were. The convergence of these parallel histories in the physical underground of Canada is not coincidental. It reflects the structural logic of exclusion, which produces the same spatial responses in different communities because the spatial problem being responded to is the same. When you cannot use the surface, you use what is below it. You engineer it for the specific combination of functions you need. You maintain it as long as you need it. You adapt it as your needs change. And you do not document it in ways that might be used against you. The result, across multiple communities and multiple periods, is a Canadian underground whose extent and complexity significantly exceeds what the official record describes. The question of how much exceeds it. How much has been destroyed, how much survives in degraded form detectable only by geophysical survey, how much remains intact and simply undiscovered, is the central investigative question of a generation of scholars who are only now beginning to have the tools to approach it seriously. Here is what the combination of oral history, archival research, geophysical survey, and geochemical analysis is beginning to show. In Victoria, the Fan Tan Alley Passage System extends beyond the areas that even community oral tradition consistently described. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies consistent with tunnel features in blocks adjacent to the known Chinatown district, suggesting that the system's reach into the surrounding commercial area was greater than previously understood. Some of these anomalies align with documentary evidence of Chinese-owned properties from the relevant period, providing the kind of corroborating context that gives the physical evidence interpretive weight. In the Keatley Creek area of the Fraser Canyon, LiDAR surveys conducted in collaboration with Secwepemc Nation have identified surface modifications, subtle changes in topography that reflect the presence of now collapsed subterranean structures that extend the known boundaries of the Pit House village significantly. The implications for understanding the size and complexity of pre-contact settlement at the site are still being worked through, but the preliminary indication is that the village was considerably larger than the excavated portion suggested, and that its underground infrastructure extended over a much wider area. In southern Ontario, geochemical sampling of soil in areas associated with the historical black settlements has produced phosphorus signatures consistent with sustained human occupation at locations where no above-ground structures survive and no documentary record specifically identifies habitation. These signatures are precisely what the methodology predicts would remain after the collapse or demolition of structures built in the period and materials available in the mid-19th century. They are not proof of specific structures, but they are evidence of human presence in specific locations, and in combination with oral tradition and historical context, they constitute a form of evidence that deserves to be taken seriously. What all of this adds up to is a picture of the Canadian underground that is, in every dimension that can currently be measured, larger than the official account. Larger spatially, larger temporally, more complex in its internal organization, more intentional in its design, more human in the fullest sense of that word, which is to say, more reflecting of the full range of human experience, including the experience of suffering, of ingenuity under duress, of building life in the space that remains after the better spaces have been denied. The ground-penetrating radar unit being pushed along a sidewalk in downtown Moose Jaw on a quiet fall morning is looking for exactly this. The anomalies it finds will not speak. They will produce signatures on a screen that require interpretation. And the interpretation will require context, and the context will require the kind of collaborative, patient, cross-disciplinary work that Canadian institutions have been slow to fund and support. But the signatures are there. The underground is there. The history is in the ground, waiting with the patience that only the ground can actually maintain. The patience of geology, of chemistry, of the slow processes that preserve organic material and alter soil composition and leave the traces of human habitation readable to instruments that did not exist a generation ago. The map beneath the map is waiting to be drawn. The people who built it, who dug it and maintained it, and lived in it and died in it, and remembered it through the long decades when no one in the official world was looking. They are waiting too. Not in any supernatural sense, in the sense that their history has not yet been fully told, and the telling of it is overdue. That telling requires, more than anything else, a willingness to ask whose ground this actually is, and what it actually holds, and what it actually means, that we have been so slow to find out. The tunnels are real. The communities that built them are real. The history they produced is real. And the Canada that emerges from that history, complicated, layered, unwilling to fit neatly into national mythology, is the Canada that was actually here, not the Canada on the official maps, the one in the ground. Sleep well. The tunnels will be there in the morning, and so will the questions.